Welcome to the Style Free Podcast, where a father and son detail and digress on the wide variety of topics within music, art, family, and culture. Your hosts are Professor Stephen J. Tyson Sr. and Jr., also known as Dad and Papo. In today's episode, we learn about Avel de Knight, the 20th century Caribbean American artist whose work helped to inspire an incredible new era of visual art from Black artists in the United States and abroad. Welcome back for a second season of the Style Free Podcast. Really excited to get another season rolling with you, Dad.
It's great to be back with you, Papo, as always.
Awesome. So I remember that in one of our episodes in season one, we had discussed The Fifth Dimension and their musical director, Avel de Knight. And in that conversation, we also had brought up Renee's brother, Avel. And it was really intriguing to me because I know Avel and the de Knight family are, it's extended family to us, but it was really intriguing because I don't think a lot of people really know about the legacy of Avel de Knight, his importance as an African-American modern artist, and then the legacy that he has left not here just in the United States, but then also in Paris, France, and other countries abroad too. So I know that you have a lot of personal and professional connection and investment to the legacy and estate of Avel de Knight. So I was just curious for just myself, but then also for our listeners to really kind of pick your brain about, who Avel de Knight is, who is this artist, and giving us an opportunity to get to know him a bit better.
Well, thanks for asking the question. Avel de Knight was a really incredible 20th century visual artist. Avel was born in 1923 in New York City. He came from a family of Caribbean immigrants. His mother came from Puerto Rico. His father came from Barbados. His mother's roots actually extend further back in terms of her father, who came from St. Thomas, the island of St. Thomas. And his parents married in 1911 in New York. And shortly after that, they started a family of 4 children, the oldest being Dollarita. Next was Renee, whose real name was Edgar. Then came Francis, and in 1923 was Avel. Avel came on the scene. Initially, they all lived down on 63rd Street, what's known as the Phipps Houses, which was affordable housing for those of modest means. And shortly after that, they eventually moved to Harlem on 111th Street, which incidentally is where my mother, your grandmother, and your grandfather first met.
In the same building or on
in
the
same
block?
Building.
Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so your grandparents, paternal grandparents, met when they were just little tiny kids. So Avel grew up in this household, and many of the members of the family were talented in various ways in the arts. Dollarita was interested in fashion. Edgar, or Renee, was interested in music, in piano. Mm-hmm. And Francis was interested in dance. Mm-hmm. And Avel, from the time he was a little child, loved to do art. His mother was a seamstress, and so she would have little pieces of fabric that would fall to the ground, and he would collect them and start arranging them. It was like creating a collage.
Yeah.
So being around this creative milieu was very inspirational to him. And as the years went on, he got a little bit older. Your paternal grandmother, Tony, came to join the family. And that's when she got to know Avel. They were first cousins. Mm-hmm. Now, here's an interesting thing. See, Avel's mother was Antipas, mm-hmm. but Antipas' sister was Serafina. Mm-hmm. But they, I believe, were the aunts of Grandma Tony. Mm-hmm. But exactly where that line is,
it gets a little gray.
It gets gray. It's majorly gray. So I can't really talk about those details. So anyway, to keep it simple, eventually your grandmother, Tony, came to live with the de Knight family. And that's where she and Avel, being closer in age than the other of Avel's siblings, spent a lot of time together.
Mm-hmm.
And they would go to St. Nicholas Terrace. They would go near City College in New York City, and they would go for walks, talk, photograph each other. And in those days, everyone dressed up. Everyone looked, no matter, you may have not had a lot of money, coming from a family of modest means, and yet everyone was always impeccably dressed. You dressed to impress, and that was the way it was. And so Avel has always been a fashion plate. In fact, one of the things that inspired me growing up was the way that your grandmother would dress and put herself together. Her silver, her turquoise.
Yeah.
All of these things fascinated me and influenced the way I think about color and arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
And so Avel came from that milieu. Now, his father came from Bridgetown, Barbados, as I mentioned, and he was a shipping clerk in downtown Manhattan at a place called Arthur Brown and Sons.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever supplies would come in, he would check those off and make sure things got where they needed to be. But he would also bring home supplies for this budding young artist named Avel. So as the years went on, Avel, going into high school, attended Benjamin Franklin High School in East Harlem, just off the Harlem River Drive.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, as he said, one of the top 3 in his art class. And he eventually became the president of the art club.
Oh, wow.
So everyone looked toward Avel. And he had the idea of becoming a commercial artist.
Mm-hmm.
So he attended Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And then the Second World War intervened and he was drafted.
So when you say like a commercial artist, do you mean like somebody who's getting commissioned to do paintings for different businesses, or do you mean like he's painting walls of a business?
By that, I mean that he would be hired to do illustrations for different types of advertising campaigns.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. And I have some examples of some of the work that he was doing in Pratt and in high school that were commercially oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Designs for record covers and the like.
Mm-hmm.
So this was his trajectory. And then when the Second World War came, he was drafted into the army and wound up serving in France. Now, his sister, Frances, told me that when he was a little boy, that she used to read him a story about a French girl named Colette, and that there was a French bakery not far from where they lived in Harlem. And so they would go and they would pick up baguettes and things of this nature. And so that French component was always there. Of course, Spanish was spoken in the family because his mother was Puerto Rican. But nevertheless, French became in his DNA. I mean, he just absorbed everything about French culture. And when he was in France, he decided that after the war, he would go back on the GI Bill of Rights and study in France. And that's essentially what he did. Over a 10-year period between 1946 and 1956, he studied at 3 institutes: the Académie de la Grande Jaumère, the Académie Julienne, and the École des Beaux-Arts.
Wow. Were there Black artists, being kind of accepted into these types of art schools at that time pretty consistently, or was he kind of an anomaly in that?
That's a great question. I know there were a number of GIs, and they were very intrepid. The idea of going and living in a foreign country with a language that was not your native tongue took a lot of, lack of a better term, chutzpah.
Yeah.
And he, along with other African-American artists, studied there. He was not the only one. He had a room at the Cité Universitaire, which is where many students from different countries would go and they would study there in France. And one of the people that was his roommate was a gentleman by the name of Hugh Marius. And Hugh and Avel were very close. Hugh was going into the area of law. And there was also another artist that he met there at the Cité Universitaire, which was Herb Gentry.
Mm.
And Herb Gentry was a very, very important African American expressionist artist. And when I first met Herb, Avel and I were attending a lecture by Romare Bearden at the National Academy of Design. And the lecture was basically about the relationship between collage, jazz, and the history of art.
Wow.
And afterwards, Romare and Herb was standing side by side. And so Avel and Romare had known each other and had worked together on art shows in the past. And Romare really respected Avel as an artist. And as I say, they were friends.
Hmm.
And I was asking Romare about the kind of glue that he used in his collages.
Yeah.
And he said, well, it's a product that was produced by the Navy called Duco. And I said, oh, and I made a note of that. And Romare and I had met earlier. That's another story for another time, perhaps, but on several occasions. And I had brought my students to meet Romare at Bronx Community College,
Hmm.
along with Ozzie Davis and other individuals who were on the panel, Felipe Luciano and June
Wow.
Jordan and others. Yeah. I always wanted to expose my students there in the Bronx to experiences that they would probably otherwise not experience, to meet
Hmm.
people and to see other possibilities.
Hmm.
And I think that Romare had the same spirit because he was always very supportive. I talked to him on the phone shortly before he died. He had been released from the hospital. He was suffering from bone cancer.
Mm.
I didn't know this at the time. In fact, on the day that he died, I was working on a collage in the kitchen in Johnstown, where we were
Hmm.
living at the time. It's a piece called Forest Walk.
Oh, I
And
remember that. I know that piece.
yes, I was working on that particular piece, which in part has the inspiration of not only Romare Bearden, but also Aaron Douglas.
Hmm.
And that was subsequently purchased by Twitty Styles, who just recently passed away,
Wow. Yeah.
another important figure in his own right. But at any rate, what was I saying about Romare and saying something about, there's a reason I was bringing, oh, so then Romare at that point turned to Herb Gentry and he said, Herb, I want you to meet Avel's cousin. This is Stephen Tyson. And I said, Herb, it's very, I said, no, I said, Mr. Gentry, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hmm.
And he was very warm, very gracious. We shook hands. Little did I know that a number of years later that he and I would be spending more time together. I would be interviewing him and talking about his life.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I have that videotape. And so that's when I first met Herb. And I didn't know at the time that Herb and Avel had known each other at the Cité Universitaire.
Yeah.
All right. So all of these amazing artists together, Avel was connected to the world of art.
Hmm.
People knew Avel; they admired him as his draftsmanship. And another important figure that Avel met when he was in Paris was a gentleman by the name of Ellsworth Kelly.
Hmm.
Ellsworth Kelly became one of the pioneering non-objective artists, visual artists of the 20th century, sort of a
Wow.
minimalist hard edge style. And some of his work also was inspired by the concept of chance.
Hmm.
This is something that was explored by people like a friend of his by the name of John Cage, based on the Book of Changes, the I Ching.
Mm. Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
this idea of this randomness, but yet there's an underlying order within that randomness,
Yeah.
and being able to tap into that and to express the life that comes out of that experience.
Yeah. So Avel's at these different universities and studying in Paris, and you mentioned that he had these ideas or ambitions of being a commercial artist. Then how did he kind of start shifting into some of the subject matter and styles that we kind of know of Avel today, where it seems like a mix of classical, architecture, uh, obelisks, and Egyptian type artwork. There's just a lot of mixed cultural relevance within his work. So I'm just curious as to how he kind of evolved from doing something, or how he evolved from having an ambition of something that was more commercial and corporate to something that is more expressive of spirit and self?
That's a great question, Papo. I believe that came out of the experience of living and studying in Paris.
Mm.
One of the things that you find in Avel's work is the influence of people like Odilon Redon, who's a French late 19th century symbolist painter who also worked with pastels. And Avel was inspired by the life of the mind, of the imagination. He became friends with a writer and artist by the name of Jean Cocteau, who was also very close friends with Picasso. So being in this milieu of artists who were traversing boundaries, not staying confined conceptually, visually, I think that this spirit of freedom is something that Avel embraced and then exuded through his work. Not right away. The seeds were sown in France, and they would later manifest in the mid to late 1960s in his work.
So did he end up staying in Paris? Was that where he lived most of his life, or was he kind of traveling back and forth between Paris and New York, or did he venture into any other countries at all?
Avel lived for about 10 years on and off in Paris. He would spend some time in Paris, then he would go to New York, eventually settling in Greenwich Village. First, he lived on Christopher Street and then moved to Perry Street. I don't know if you ever visited his apartment, but he transformed this apartment into, I don't know what he transformed it into, but it was very eclectic. It had Japanese prints. It had works from Indonesia. It had European influences and sculpture and the obelisks and things of that nature, exquisitely arranged. He was really a master arranger. And this is something that can be attested to by one of his dear friends, Edward Field. Edward and Neil Derrick, his partner, also lived not too far from where Avel was living. And Avel designed part of the living space where Neil and Edward Field, the great poet, were living. And so I guess I think that answers your question. I first met Avel on my first birthday party. And he was sitting there. There's some raw color footage of my birthday. And I'm a little toddler. I'm walking by this time.
It was like 1957.
And, yeah. And Avel is sitting there, I think eating some chicken or on a lawn chair. And it's a night. And and there was a little dog running around by a fence, and I'm pinching the dog's nose, his wet snout, through the fence. And that was my first encounter with Avel.
At this time, was he gaining some sort of prominence as an artist himself, or was he more into teaching? Like, I'm curious as to how he started getting more publicly known for his work.
Well, Avel started exhibiting with a number of artists like Andy Warhol, among others, in the 1950s. This is before Andy Warhol blew up, when Andy Warhol was doing mostly commercial type illustrations. Andy wasn't the only artist in the group, but he was among a number of artists in these exhibitions that Avel would participate in.
Yeah.
So that's when people started really paying attention to Avel. And by the mid to late 1950s, that's when Avel started exhibiting his first one-man show at places like the Sagittarius Gallery, which unfortunately no longer exists. And so that's when he started getting public attention. Again, the kinds of subjects that he was painting at that time were matadors, were people sitting on benches. These are the kinds of subjects that he would, and you could see the influence of artists, French artists, in his work. Vuillard, Bonnat, these are some of the artists who, I believe, not in terms of their patterning, but in terms of their quiet, meditative or reflective subjects in the work.
Yeah.
Many of the figures you see, there's a kind of stillness in many of these figures, and that would permeate many years later You don't see a whole lot of action and movement in Avel's figures in his work for the most
Yeah.
part. You basically see people relaxing, sleeping. I
Mm-hmm.
remember in one individual told Avel, he said, I've never seen so many sleeping Arabs in, in a painting before, because he liked to explore figures that were robed. And, this is by the mid 60s. He
Yeah.
started showing figures that had the influences of Islamic cultures that he encountered when he first went to places like Samarkand and Bukhara. These were Islamic places that were part of the USSR at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And Avel traveled there in 1961 under the auspices of the US State Department to give slide lectures, to talk about American art and art in general.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he was exposed to these other cultures. And as I say, the influence of Islamic culture on Avel was really, in a sense, a gateway into exploring the exotic, right, in a
Mm.
different way, not
Yeah.
European now. And really, it was a gateway into exploring the experience of North Africa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of his heroes in art was Eugene Delaqua, who's a French 19th century artist who has a series of journals that were based on his travels to North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no direct evidence that Avel himself ever traveled to North Africa. I know he had aspirations to travel there, in part because of Delacroix. But the experience of the cultures in North Africa, many of which are Islamic, found its way into his depiction of figures. And one of the interesting things that happened in 1961 when he was lecturing in the Soviet Union, one of the students came to him and said, we've been hearing about the boycotts and freedom riders and things going on in the United States. How does your work relate to the civil rights struggle, of your people there?
Mm-hmm.
And Avel took a moment and he said, well, one of the great things about the United States is that you had the freedom to express the way that you want to express. And as an artist, I want to express myself by the subject matter that I choose. That's one of the freedoms.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily have to depict people on a bus or things like that. I'm paraphrasing
Yeah.
essentially what he said.
Yeah.
And so the person seemed somewhat not completely satisfied with the answer.
Yeah.
but that question stayed in his mind. How can I make my work relevant to the experience of what it means to be Black in the United States?
Yeah.
But the way he was going to do it is not to narrowly define it in terms of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
but to expand it and make it more universal.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
because Black
so,
people all over the world.
exactly. And so when you see pyramids in his work, when you
Mm-hmm.
see some figures with an afro,
Mm-hmm.
wearing robes, that ties in with the whole Afrocentric impulse that was beginning to take place in the United States.
Yeah.
So Avel found in his own way a path to unify the influences, the European, the classical European works of ancient Greece and Rome,
Mm-hmm.
from his studies. And he had also traveled to Italy and other places. So he was exposed to what the West had to offer in terms
Mm-hmm.
of antiquity, the various eras of
Yeah.
art that existed in Europe. So now he's taking the African influence. He's looking at magazines that has images of people from East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking at the patterns, the way that they create patterns on their faces with paint, scarification,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of clothes. And and looking at their African sculpture, their mass. Then he begins to incorporate that into his work.
Yeah.
That's how Avel was able to create this amalgam. And I had the opportunity in the early 90s to witness him working on a piece. And guess where he worked in his apartment? which, as I say, had Chinese fans and had Middle Eastern and North African. He had molding that came from, that had Islamic influence that he attached to the corners of walls. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. It was like walking into the world.
Wow.
In his space.
Yeah.
And I still have some of those artifacts. And after he passed, rather before he passed, we were having dinner. I know I'm digressing here. I'll come back to the painting, to the work of art. But he said to me, listen, you're an artist. We've been to shows together. We traveled to see the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat in his last exhibit in 1988. We had talked with people like June Kelly, and among other people that Avel knew. We went to photography shows. So he knew, and he had even invested and purchased some of my work too. And so he said, when the day comes, I would like you to have and take care of my artistic legacy. It's a lot of responsibility, but I would like you to be the one to do that. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, of course, I will do that, because I loved him. Yeah. I knew he loved me, and I wanted to honor his memory. And so almost every show that I've curated since that time has featured one of Avel's pieces. Yeah. And one of the things that he wanted that he was not able to achieve in his lifetime, but he hoped that would be done after he passed, was a major retrospective. And I was able to achieve that with the help of his good friend, Richard Waller, who is the director of the University of Richmond Museums in Richmond, Virginia. And they had worked together at the Brooklyn Museum. That's when they first got to know each other. So I was honored to be able to work with Richard and Elizabeth Schlater on the retrospective for Avel called Myth and Mirage, The Art of Avel de Knight in 2001. And this took place just before 9/11. Yeah. Yeah. So coming back to the piece in his apartment, so I had the opportunity to see Avel working on a piece that became known as Still Life with Column. It's a large pastel piece that shows an African mask, a fragment of Michelangelo's portrait of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. And this, again, it exemplifies this amalgam of different cultures coming together in his work. And he told me at that time, he said, this is a very important piece. And it truly is. It's a remarkable piece. And this particular piece and a number of other pieces are currently being represented by Burgess Fine Arts in New York City. And Bill Burgess is not only a businessman and has this particular collection, but he is also an artist in his own right. So he has the artist sensitivity, and he loves Avel's work. And Avel was friends with a number of artists, as I say, including Betty Blayton Taylor, who, by the way, was also an art instructor at HARU Act, which is where your grandfather was initially the project director, and then became the executive director in '64. And she then later on became the founder of the Children's Art Carnival, located in Harlem. And I had the opportunity when I was in graduate school at City College to do an internship there. And so that's where she and I connected the first time. And I had her subsequently in two of the art shows that I curated, one at the New York State Museum and up in Saratoga Springs.
Wow, that's cool.
Also, there was Carl Lundy and Roy Moore. These were individuals who were writers. And Jacob Lawrence, another noted African-American artist, was a friend of Avel's. Herman Rose, his wife, Elia Braca Rose, who was an actress in radio from the 1930s for quite a number of years. Elia and Avel were very, very close, very, very close. It's a photograph of both of them hanging some work together in Greenwich Village. They were part of a group called the Village Art Gallery. I think that's it. Arthur Mitchell, the Dance Theater of Harlem, was a friend of Avel's. Raymond St. Jacques, the actor. Many people might remember him from a film called Cotton Comes to Harlem with Godfrey Cambridge, and many others. Were all friends of Avel. So he was in the mix, as they say.
Yeah.
But as the years went on and as the AIDS crisis began to develop in the 1980s, Avel started losing quite a number of his friends. And he became somewhat despondent. He would still join us at family occasions. You remember seeing Avel at Thanksgivings, at your uncle's and other places. But his friends were leaving. If it wasn't age, and Avel was relatively young, but when he died, he was 72. And so he became somewhat despondent and also reclusive, didn't go out as much. Before he would go out to the opera, he used to like to dance every once in a while, whatever the latest dances were. If you were to look at his playlist of some of the music that he would listen to, he was listening to people like Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, Carole King, Tapestry, It's Too Late Baby, the Jackson 5, Never Can't Say Goodbye, Buddy Miles, Them Changes, the Rolling Stones, Lobo, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker. I mean, the list goes on. He was very much in tune with that. And also a group that he particularly had an interest in was called the Fifth Dimension.
Right. Did he ever get to collaborate with Renee on anything that he did? Whether it was, kind of blending music and art or anything? Were they able to do any collaborations at all? Or with any of his siblings, really?
No, he never did. That would have been fantastic if he had done the album cover for the Fifth Dimension or something of that nature. But no, they didn't. Although Edgar or Renee and Avel were very close. You can see photographs of them together in 1949 in London. This is when Renee was with the Delta Rhythm Boys. You can see photographs of them in Avel's apartment, along with your uncle and his wife, back in the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and also meeting with them in Paris. So, yeah, they were remained close, but they never officially worked together, to my recollection.
And when was Avel's, I guess, heyday? Like his peak period of producing art? Was it the 60s or did it kind of trickle into the 70s at all?
So Avel's peak, as you might say, really extended between the 70s and the 80s.
Okay.
That would be the period of time where he was working on what was known as his Mirage Series. The Mirage Series had a series of bands, overlapping bands, often in gouache. That was a medium that he chose to work in, which he felt very comfortable in. He initially started in oil painting. It's a water-based medium, similar to tempera.
Okay.
And of course, watercolor. I mean, he was a master watercolorist. That's one of the things that your grandfather, my father Ty, would often remark. It's just the incredible way that he used watercolor.
Wow.
The way that he was able to evoke light and space, air, atmosphere. It takes a great deal of skill to be able to master it the way that he did. And also with gouache, he would use a rule so that he create these horizon lines where you had these overlapping planes, so that you could see perhaps a pyramid in the distance and you would be going toward that pyramid, but you never quite get there because the planes shift. It's a mirage, but it's one that he felt that was important to always to have a goal, to have an ideal. And that pyramid for him was, he said, like the Mount Saint-Victor in Provence for artists like Cézanne, the 19th century post-impressionist artist.
Wow, that's incredible.
I remember when I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh in Johnstown that Avel came to stay with us because I had a 10-year retrospective for Avel at the college.
Yeah.
And you were very little at the time. You were actually about 2 or 3. And Avel stayed with us. And one of the things that he showed me was the way in which he could take a stick, went outside and got a twig,
Mm-hmm.
and dipped it in ink,
Mm-hmm.
and then started to draw with the stick and ink. And he said, you don't have as much control as if you're working with a pen or a pencil, piece of graphite.
Mm-hmm.
But what it allows you to do is to see that in those variations, there are new possibilities.
Wow.
And so the idea of the subconscious coming
Mm-hmm.
through
Mm-hmm.
is something that he valued.
That's really
Somebody might
cool.
look at something as being a mistake or an accident, but the possibilities that can be revealed out of that is like a form of redemption.
Yeah.
It's like a person or an artist or a musician, and they play a wrong note or wrong chord, but that wrong chord or note can become right by the next note or chord that you play.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. So I guess I'm curious as to what the legacy can evolve into for Avel. I mean, you mentioned that he kind of charged you with the monumental responsibility of making sure that his work, his story, his importance continues to touch future generations. So, where do you see the legacy of Avel heading?
Well, there are a number of venues that have collected the work of Avel, places like the Leslie Lohman Gallery of Gay and Lesbian Art. I think they might have changed their name, though, now that I think about it. I think it's the Lohman Gallery, the Leslie Lohman Gallery. The Petrucci Family Foundation, which has collected works of African American artists with the advice and input of people like Beresford Booth. And there are a number of places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art that have Avel's work in their collection, in their holdings, the Fleming Museum. Um, the list goes on. And I think that with the use of podcasts like this and technology, that uh, we're going to be able to reach more people. Avel has a website, aveldeknight.net, that I invite all people to go visit, check out. And what are some of your thoughts about Avel?
I honestly don't have that many memories
Mhm.
about Avel. I know that he would come to some family functions like Thanksgivings and things like that. When he was there, I would notice how you and him would really talk and connect a lot,
Mhm.
assumedly talking about art.
Mhm.
Um, and it always seemed like his artwork was more important and of a greater value than what it seems the public narrative is. It doesn't seem like anybody knows about Avel. Doesn't seem like anybody, you know, is wanting to know about Avel. And so it's one of the reasons why whenever we did the Fifth Dimension podcast and we mentioned Renee DeKnight, that it made me think about, well, what about discussing Avel? We mentioned him in that podcast. He is of somebody who the world needs to know. And so, yeah, I think that there's an opportunity for his legacy to become part of the greater conversation in Black American visual artists, uh, or I should say, of Black American visual artists.
There's no question about that, Papo. Avel is definitely unsung. And while people acknowledge the mastery of his craftsmanship, you're right. The market has not completely become aware of his talent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the reason, I've talked to several people about this, and one of the reasons is because his work as a whole cannot fit into a particular box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can't look at his work. He doesn't do just genre art, people just doing everyday things or sitting on a bench or what have you. He also has winged figures. He has angels. He has Pegasus, horses. He has mysterious light and orbs of light emanating from hands, like like a Reiki master or something.
Yeah.
He his work defies easy categorization. And I think that makes it difficult for those who might otherwise want to show his work to figure out how to market it. What kind of niche does he fit into that we can then promote?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's been one of the issues related to Avel and getting his name out there as much as it deserves to be. I think it's going to eventually happen. I think there have been a lot of changes and walls coming down, and but it's going to simply take a concerted effort to make sure that his name is in the mix for a variety of different international exhibits that are going on. I think it may also require a grant and some independent work, the production of a film, a book, not just about Avel's life, but how Avel's life is connected to a broader context of the African diaspora, of the American experience in general. And I think that that is timely and I think important.